So why look at an RX 6700 XT against an RTX 3060? They're not really designed to be competitors with each other. But the market dictates the price, and currently the prices are surprisingly close. So actually, if we pop over to PC Part Picker, which surveys a lot of major hardware retailers to get a good idea of what the current lowest prices are, if we look at the RTX 3060, wow, actually, in between yesterday and today, it looks like the price has come down a bit. The $370 for the RTX 3060 is better than I've seen it recently. So hey, let's give it to them. It has come down a little bit. But if we look at the RX 6700 XT, it's not a significant price jump if you're buying the cheapest models. And again, when we look at the RTX 3060, many of the cooler models are closer to that same price as the RX 6700 XT. So the 6700 XT is still carrying a little bit of a price premium, but it's not a massive one. Now, some people would be like, you should be comparing this to the 3060 Ti. That would be the fair comparison. Well, the 3060 Ti out on the normal market is still commanding at least $470 to $480. That is a major jump in price. So I think that right now, the current closest price competitor between AMD and Nvidia is the 6700 XT and the RTX 3060, with a little bit of a price premium to that 6700 XT. Now, the specific models that I'm testing here are actually the ones that we saw in this video, with the RTX 3060 being the ROG Strix cooler. So I have a very good cooler on that one, and I just have the AMD reference cooler on my 6700 XT. So if you notice, cooling deficits definitely point to those cooler models as the reason. Let's jump into a whole bunch of comparisons here, because it's going to be interesting, especially when we get into ray tracing, because we know AMD is way behind in terms of ray tracing performance, but when you're comparing a higher performance tier against a lower performance tier because their pricing is about the same, things get really interesting. All right, let's see the side-by-sides and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. All right, we'll start out with Cyberpunk 2077 at the 1080p Ultra settings. Now, this is more demanding than most games out there. Some people would just call it unoptimized, but the point is, when you're buying a graphics card, you're buying it for, at least a few years probably, and games tend to get more demanding over time. So it makes sense to take one of the most demanding current titles to get at least some idea of what your performance might be like in the near future for the lifetime of your GPU. And we can see here that the 6700 XT is absolutely crushing the RTX 3060, which is, to be fair, delivering a pretty good experience. We saw some dips below 60 FPS, but it wasn't terrible. And the 6700 XT is drawing a little bit more power. Usually AMD is a bit more power efficient, but remember, we're using a step up in terms of performance tier, but we're comparing them because the pricing is what, in my opinion, matters here. And it's not much more power. The temperature difference is explained by the coolers on these graphics cards, with the reference model 6700 XT against the ROG Strix amazing cooler on my RTX 3060, and both of them are at their out-of-the-box settings. Now, since the 3060 did seem to need a little help if we wanted to stay above 60 FPS the whole time, I thought it would be fun to try out turning down to the high settings on the 3060 and see how that performance stacks up against the 6700 XT. But actually, the 6700 XT's performance at the maxed out Ultra settings, I mean maxed out without ray tracing, we'll look at that in a minute, is still having a significant win over the 3060, even with the dialed back settings. So really, guys, the performance here isn't that close at all. It's pretty one-sided for the 6700 XT. Now, we're definitely going to need to look into some other stuff. I mean, a lot of people know that Nvidia GPUs on this current architecture tend to scale better at higher resolutions, and have better ray tracing performance and all that. But remember, we're comparing this higher tier card against the lower tier 3060 from Nvidia. So let's see how all of that ends up stacking up. So let's switch over to 1440p. Now we can see here that if we leave it at the ultra settings, even the 6700 XT can't always maintain above 60 FPS in really demanding titles like this. Now, to be clear, as we'll see in some later tests in this video, in many titles, the 6700 XT can just max it out at 1440p no problem, and even the 3060 can max out a lot of older and or less demanding titles at 1440p. So using both of these at 1440p is a reasonable choice, although we can see here once again, despite Nvidia scaling a little better at 1440p and higher resolutions, it's not enough to make any significant inroads on the 6700 XT. And maybe surprising to some people, even using DLSS at the quality setting does not even allow the 3060 to catch up to the native performance of the 6700 XT at these settings. But what I find extremely interesting is that that is going to change depending on the graphics settings used. When I dropped the 6700 XT down to the high settings, I was able to keep it above 60 FPS the vast majority of the time, so I figured these would be good settings to use. Whereas the 3060 had to drop down to the medium settings in order to roughly match that performance with the above 60 FPS most of the time. But I thought it would be interesting once again to try out the DLSS quality setting, which does look quite good at 1440p, and a lot of people will use it. And at the high settings, I'm actually getting it to outperform the 6700 XT at the native resolution. So to be clear, that's not really an apples to apples comparison. I just think it's interesting because when we were at the ultra settings, DLSS quality did not allow the 3060 to catch up to the 6700 XT. So it's not really as simple as the 3060 can't catch up using DLSS to the native performance of the 6700 XT. It looks like that's just going to depend on the particular title and graphics settings that you're using, which I find to be pretty interesting. Now, I don't think that 4K is the best use case for these GPUs, or in other words, I don't think that these are the best GPUs to choose if you're planning on playing at 4K, but I'll throw this one 4K test in there just to get some comparisons. And it's also a chance to look at FSR versus DLSS. Now, Cyberpunk only features FSR 1.0, although there are mods that allow you to add FSR 2.0 into the game through unofficial means. And I know some people want me to be using that in my benchmark, but again, I don't usually benchmark using modifications. I like to use out-of-the-box stock settings and things like that. Now, because the 6700 XT is so much more powerful than the 3060, I'm able to use the ultra quality setting, which is actually very close to a native 4K quality, whereas DLSS, I'm having to go down to the balance setting just to get near 60 FPS, and it's still failing to do it. And that's rendering it below 1440p, if I remember correctly. And so the 6700 XT certainly does seem to be the stronger GPU, even going up to the 4K resolution here, delivering a better performance and possibly image quality. But how about that ray tracing? This is the part that I think most people thought the 3060 would just take the win on, because everybody knows Nvidia ray traces better than AMD. And sure, it does. But it's more complicated than that when you're looking at a higher tier AMD GPU against a lower tier Nvidia GPU. When we use the ray tracing low settings at 1080p, which is just local shadows, so honestly it's not very impactful to the image quality in my opinion, but performance-wise, the 6700 XT is actually winning. And using DLSS on the 3060 gets it to roughly match and maybe beat the 6700 XT at native, but once again, my opinion of DLSS at 1080p is that it's not worth it, especially if you could get good performance just by not using ray tracing, and especially ray tracing low, which just gets the local shadows, which, like I said, I think the shadows look slightly more accurate, but the non-ray traced versions, I think, look fine, and it's not really worth the performance hit here. But once again, we see the 6700 XT actually winning at ray tracing against the 3060. But it's more complicated than that, because if you use different ray tracing settings, the performance delta between the GPUs changes. If we use the ray tracing medium preset in this game, it turns on sun shadows and lighting at the medium ray traced setting, in addition to leaving on the local shadows. And once we do that, the performance between the two GPUs closes, but the 3060 takes a very small lead. So the 3060 is better at the ray tracing medium settings, but it's very, very close. It's basically a tie. Now, once again, I was allowing the 3060 to use some DLSS Quality to see how that goes, and it wasn't able to get a 60 FPS experience with the ray tracing medium settings, which to me, once again, means definitely not worth it, especially using DLSS at 1080p. So really, the 3060 isn't a strong ray tracing GPU. There are certainly games and ray tracing settings that it can use with usable performance, but it's maybe not super meaningful. However, a lot of people are interested in ray traced reflections, and I've noticed that Nvidia GPUs seem to have an outsized lead at ray traced reflections when compared with other ray tracing settings, especially shadows. So here we're seeing the 3060 actually with a pretty noticeable win over the 6700 XT when we're looking at the ray traced reflections just added to the 1080p Ultra preset. Although, again, it's below a 60 FPS performance here, so I probably wouldn't use it. The good news is if you want to use DLSS Quality, you actually are getting a pretty good refresh rate now. So for those of you who are okay with using DLSS at 1080p and you don't mind the little bit of extra aliasing in the pavement and a little bit of blurriness, ghosting, things like that, you're fine with it to get the ray traced reflections. Fair enough, and you're getting a pretty good experience here. I don't like FSR 1.0 at 1080p at all, so I didn't choose to use it on the 6700 XT for this comparison. But not every game is as demanding as Cyberpunk, even with ray tracing. So ray trace reflections actually work just fine on the 6700 XT and Guardians of the Galaxy. However, it does work better on the 3060. Also, I'll just note that the gameplay felt smoother than what the image quality looks like here on my AMD GPU. For some reason, this game doesn't record well at 1080p on my AMD graphics cards, despite other games recording well, and even this game at different resolutions recording well. I'm not quite sure why that happens. But this game does just feature ray traced reflections at various settings, and the maximum setting I've also turned on ray traced transparencies. The 3060 can't quite handle the maximum, but it did look pretty good at the high settings and handled it really well. But if we turn off ray tracing in this title, we see that the 6700 XT has definitely has a win. 1080p, sometimes the performance delta closes between the two, but if you look at the GPU usage percentage, it's usually dropping at that point, meaning I'm actually getting such a high frame rate that the CPU limit is coming into play a little bit. Whereas we see a more consistent large lead at 1440p. And Guardians of the Galaxy is actually an Nvidia favored title. If you look at GPUs that generally are even with each other, the the Nvidia GPU will usually outperform in this game versus gaming on average. Now let's go ahead and look at God of War, and we can see here that at 1080p ultra settings, we're going to see in a second that the RTX 3060 actually can't maintain above 60 FPS in every scene, even just at 1080p, whereas the 6700 XT is absolutely crushing it. So I tried turning down these shadow settings from ultra to high, which is the most demanding performance setting in the game. And that greatly helped out the performance on the 3060, but you definitely notice the difference in shadow quality, and it still doesn't actually catch up to the 6700 XT at the maximum settings. So big win here for AMD, even though this is DirectX 11, which used to be a big win for Nvidia most of the time. The AMD drivers recently improved their DirectX 11 performance. But what if we move up to 1440p? And what if we enable DLSS Quality? Well, here we're seeing the 6700 XT at 1440p Ultra, massively outperforming the 3060 at native, and even taking the lead against DLSS Quality once again. So again, another situation where DLSS Quality doesn't even give the performance lead. And this is a game where we can show off FSR 2.0, which does look quite good. It looks much better than FSR 1.0, although it doesn't quite look as good as DLSS Quality. I'd point you towards Digital Foundry's testing on the image quality here in this game if you really want a closer look at FSR 2.0 and its pros and cons. I think the easiest thing to see in this particular scene is Kratos' beard when he breathes out. When it goes through that transparent breath, you see a little bit of crackling to the image. Now, like I said, there are definitely easier to run games out there, like Horizon Zero Dawn, where we see both GPUs able to max out the game at both 1080p and 1440p. Although I think it's interesting to look at the 6700 XT at 1440p versus the 3060 at 1080p in the middle of our screen here, because it's basically a tie. I mean, they'll go one above the other a little bit here, and it might even be a win for AMD. But again, just showing how big of a performance delta there is between these graphics cards. But again, like I said, even the 3060 is able to max out this game at 1440p. So when we dwell on games like Cyberpunk, it can sometimes hide how well these actually can perform. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 is pretty demanding, but the 3060 can handle 1080p Ultra with the occasional dip below 60 FPS. The 6700 XT easily handles 1080p Ultra, never really breaking too much of a sweat and staying pretty high refresh rate here. Now, if we look at 1440p, we can look at it both at the Ultra settings, which the 6700 XT can actually handle, but we can also use the hardware unboxed optimized settings. You can see a bit of a drop to the image quality with the volumetrics and the lighting, but the frame rate jumps quite a bit here. It's very noticeable, but definitely a win for AMD again. And I thought it would be fun, like I said, to look at the 6700 XT reference cooler that I used. Responds really well to undervolting. So here I'm undervolting it and bumping up the memory timings, and we can actually see a slight performance increase. Well, look at the temperatures. The temperatures, and I jumped later into the benchmark when it's been running a while, now have a 10 degrees Celsius gap, while once again delivering about the same or better performance than we got when we were running at the stock settings. Now, to be fair, let's look at my Strix cooler on the RTX 3060. And because it runs so cool, I figured why don't we crank up a really heavy-duty overclock, and it responds well to it with some decent performance gains, although this certainly would not be enough to give it a win over the 6700 XT, given its massive performance lead overall. Well, we saw the RTX 3060 get completely stomped. It just cannot match the performance of the 6700 XT, except for in certain ray tracing workloads, and we're not even talking all ray tracing workloads. Seem to be specifically reflections where it took a big advantage. But even then, the performance of the 3060 at ray tracing is low enough that I would imagine in many ray tracing titles, you would have it turned off. Now, if you're looking at 1080p, there definitely are situations where you might use that ray tracing. But if you're looking at 1440p, I didn't really even test the ray tracing there too much because really I don't think either card makes a lot of sense for 1440p ray tracing. Now, for 1440p, I don't think there's any question at all whatsoever. You would want to buy the 6700 XT over the 3060 unless you just have to have Nvidia for reasons I'll get into in a second. Because especially seeing that even using DLSS Quality, the performance would at best take a small lead over the native performance of the 6700 XT, but frequently would not even catch up to the performance of the 6700 XT at native 1440p performance. And then when you get into the fact that, FSR 2.0 is out now and everything like that, I really just think that for 1440p gaming, the 6700 XT is just hands down the way to go. And I really think a 3060 is kind of stretching it, although doable at 1440p. It doesn't make pay the little bit of extra money for the 6700 XT. It makes a lot more sense. Now at 1080p, I think the 3060 is a fantastic graphics card. You could be completely happy with it, and I guess you could save a little bit of money and buy the cheapest 3060 instead of the 6700 XT, but I think the longevity of the 6700 XT at 1080p and just the high refresh rate experience is way better. At this resolution, like I said, I think ray tracing could be factored in a little bit more, but it wasn't quite as dominant of a ray tracing victory as I think many people would have expected. Both of the cards have 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so that doesn't really come into play here. So I really think that the only reason you wouldn't go with the 6700 XT is if you just have to get Nvidia for a variety of reasons. Now, I would recommend that if you do have to go with Nvidia, even though on the normal market, the 3060 Ti version is a lot more expensive, Best Buy, when they have their new drops of Founders Editions cards, which usually happens on Thursday mornings, although not always, it has been a little bit easier to actually try to claim one of those. Although that's a bit complicated because you have to claim it online and then pick it up in person. Not everybody lives super close to a Best Buy, and by the time you factor in gas money and whether you got one in the first place, you know, it can be a bit of a wash. But I don't want to be acting like you can't find a $400 3060 Ti. It is possible. And you can check out my 6700 XT versus 3060 Ti video, where they are a much closer matchup and a bit more interesting of a comparison. Now, so who would need to go with Nvidia? Well, if you use your GPU for certain professional workloads, certain programs, they are programmed to just work better with Nvidia, and it would be a mistake not to get, the GPU that's going to work better with your professional workload, especially, if that's work for you. Other than that, people do feel like the Nvidia drivers are a bit more stable. I have had fewer game crashes on my Nvidia GPUs than my AMD GPUs, although my experience with the AMD GPUs has not been terrible. Crashes are not very frequent. For the most part, they just work fine, although you'll see a wide variety of opinions about this in the comment section, I'm sure. Other than that, I think some people care about live streaming, and the live streaming encoder at low bit rates does look a little bit better on Nvidia GPUs, so something that you might factor in. Although if you're just a hobby streamer, personally, I wouldn't be too hung up on that. And I have also heard that OBS has been updated to support, what is it called, B-frames or something like that for the AMD encoder, which does improve its image quality. So that's good to hear. So maybe we're closing that gap a little bit. There's some differences in their various software suites. I actually prefer the design of the AMD software package myself, and that you don't have to log into it. Whereas, the Nvidia hardware, the GeForce Experience thing you have to log into, things like that. There's differences. There's Nvidia Broadcast with RTX Voice, which AMD has now actually launched a noise removal competitor to. I haven't tested it out myself, but they do have that feature now. So a lot of these gaps are closing. And again, AMD launching things like FSR 2.0, improving their DX11 support, improving their OpenGL performance. A lot of the traditional negatives of getting the AMD GPU have been closing, although I do know some people are just gonna buy Nvidia, and I think at certain pricing tiers that can make sense. But my overall conclusion this time around is that if you buy an RTX 3060, when there's a similarly priced 6700 XT, you probably made a mistake.